All right, thank you all for being here. It's great to get such a turnout, and I know it's getting close to the holidays, so it's really good to see you all here. Thank you for coming along. I think, not least, but just as a matter of course, but also not least because of the topic of Alfred's talk, it's important, it's appropriate for us at this point to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land upon which we meet, their elders both past, present and future, and to recognize the important contribution that Indigenous peoples in Australia make to QUT and to QUT's community as well. So, you know, it's especially important, I think, in the context of a talk that is obviously about Indigenous peoples in Canada and their use of social media for dissent as well. I think all of you know me. I'm Axel Bruns. I lead the QUT Social Media Research Group. And I welcome you here on behalf of both the Social Media Research Group and the Journalism, Media and Communication discipline in the Creative Industries faculty. And hello to our friends in Radioland as well, and in streaming land. We are at least trying to live stream this. I hope it works. If not, please let us know and we'll try and restart the stream. Our Social Media Research Group is a group of about 20-25 people or so, of staff and students who research social media with a focus on a number of key areas, including news and politics, crisis communication, entertainment, and everyday uses. On platforms ranging from Facebook to Weibo, from Twitter to Wikipedia. As a group, we are quite highly research active. We've presented some 20-odd papers just over the last few months. Gone to a number of major conferences. If you're interested in more information, obviously go to socialmedia.qut.edu.au. And the major outcome really for this year, which I can't go past mentioning, is of course our book, Twitter and Society, which is appropriate to mention here because we also have a chapter from Alfred Hermida in this about one of the key contributions that Alfred's really made, particularly to the understanding of Twitter, which is to think through it as an ambient news network, and perhaps, you know, along the way you might say a few things about that at some point as well. But of course we're really here today because we've got the great honor and the great opportunity to hear from Alfred, who is on a bit of a round trip of Australia at the moment. He's done some work he's done some presentations in Sydney. He's presented at the State Library of Queensland on Wednesday. He's gone to the Walkley Awards on yesterday night. So for those of you who were there or were perhaps just watching it and playing a drinking game along, welcome, even in spite of your slight hangovers from that. Thank you all for coming along to this talk. So to say a bit more before I hand over to Alfred, Alfred is really one of the rare things in this field, both an acknowledged leading journalism practitioner as well as a scholar in the field. He was a founding editor of the BBC News site in 1997 and a long-term 16-year veteran of the BBC as well. So he's certainly got some very, very strong journalism credentials and particularly online journalism credentials as well in this space with one of the leading international institutions, particularly one of the leading innovators in online journalism as well. He's now at the Graduate School of Journalism at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver in Canada, and is the co-author of a book called Participatory Journalism, Guarding Open Gates at Online Newspapers. And in fact, he's currently working on a new book with the very catchy title, Tell Everyone How the Stories We Share Shape What We Know and Why It Matters. So that is a book I think many of us are looking forward to, again, as a way to further think through the sharing of news, particularly also through social media. Alfred's made some very important contributions to the research into the intersections really between journalism, news, social media, and as I said, developed this idea of Twitter particularly as an ambient news network. So we're really very delighted to have you here to speak about your current research on social media, on news journalism and dissent in social media. So Alfred, over to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Axel.
Thank you.
Thank you all for coming. It's a real pleasure to be here and to be able to share some of the research that I'm working on with my colleague at UBC, Countess Callison. She also, as a former journalist, went to MIT, did comparative media studies with Henry Jenkins, did her PhD from MIT and joined our school a few years ago. And she has a book coming out next year, Duke University Press, on how climate change comes to matter. Essentially, how different communities speak about climate change and how they use different language to really reflect the same concerns. This is a project we are working on, looking at the discourse around a movement that started in Canada last year called Idle No More. So just how many of you have heard of Idle No More or maybe familiar with it? A little bit. So I'm going to give a little bit of background. In some ways, it was one of these movements that was very much along the lines of Occupy. Started a very grassroots, rather disparate, but brought together people who essentially were saying no to the government. But much like with Occupy, the way the mainstream media approached it was with some suspicion, with some neglect, and then tending to dismiss it. Partly because this is a very much distributed movement. It didn't really have leaders in the traditional sense, didn't have a structure in the traditional sense, and it sort of it didn't really have a set of demands in a traditional sense. Again, it was mostly what it didn't want to happen. We have we have dual interests in this. One is to figure out how information spreads through platforms like Twitter on this, and what information is being circulated by who. But the other side of this that we're sort of we'll be working in the next couple of years is saying, well, what does this mean for journalists? How can we help journalists do a better job of reflecting these communities, which are communities but not in the traditional sense where we can say they're geographically located or they belong to particular associations. They're disorganized communities but yet have some structures. So Idle No More was a movement that started in December 2012. It started as an Aboriginal protest movement, but over the months of December and January, it sort of became a loosely knitted group, loosely knitted political movement that brought together a lot of people who were dissatisfied with the right-wing government of Stephen Harper. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's start with the man himself, our Prime Minister Stephen Harper, who has an agenda not unlike Tony Abbott. One of the issues with the Conservative government is its approach to the environment. And that's where the seeds of Idle No More started. Last year, the Conservative government introduced a bill called Bill C-38. They called it Jobs, Growth and Long-Term Prosperity Act. Because who could be opposed to jobs, growth and long-term prosperity? Now, this was called a budget implementation bill, or an omnibus bill. Essentially, what it meant was a bill that covered a whole wide range of policy and regulatory changes, all swept into one bill. Now, omnibus bills are kind of known for hiding things because they are sort of uneven in terms of what they tackle. Sometimes they essentially reinforce what was already happening. Sometimes they affirm long-accepted policies that haven't been actually written into law. But other times they open up new areas for debate and discourse. The issue with this bill was what to do with the environmental review process. And in Canada, anything to do with land, the development of land, waterways, often involves a First Nations band and involves their involvement in consultation because it's their land. And with this bill, what it was perceived as is essentially stripping the environmental review process, really what the government called streamlining, but essentially making it much easier to do resource development and bypassing previous forms of consultation. So that was the first bill we saw there. But with this bill, you would have thought that a bill that would essentially have implications for Canada's wilderness, Canada's resource development, Canada's environment would make big news. But it didn't. This is what made the headlines. Because the omnibus bill also abolished the penny. So the penny has now disappeared. And in the media, there was a lot of nostalgia about the penny, your memories of the penny, how many pennies do you have at home, are you going to be able to get rid of them, are you going to miss them, what's going to happen in the shops when you have a penny left over, all this kind of stuff. So essentially, the voice of activists raising concerns and the voices of First Nations raising concerns about what was happening to the environmental process was essentially drowned out by nostalgia about the penny. So that was stage one. The second stage came in another omnibus bill. And this is in October 2012. This one was called C45. And again, given the name Jobs and Growth Act, because again, who could you object to a Jobs and Growth Act? So this one had 400 pages and even more changes to the environmental review process. One of them was relaxing the rules on waterways and the development of resource development that might affect the streams and waterways. And again, this was seen by activists as the Harper government riding roughshod over the rights of First Nations communities and reducing their say in the development of the land and their waterways. And C45 got a group of women in Saskatoon talking. They started exchanging emails from this. It was Jessica Gordon, Sheila McLean, Sylvia McAdam, and Nina Wilson. They were concerned that the bill was eroding Indigenous rights, and they started a Facebook page to spread the word. They called the page Idle No More. The first tweet using the Idle No More hashtag was sent on November the 4th by Jessica Gordon. And not exactly a traditional call to action. More a sense of frustration, and a sense of frustration in terms of what was reflected in the media while all these changes, which would have long-term implications in communities, were taking place. We've tracked the Idle No More hashtag, and essentially it basically disappears after this till early December. But what was happening offline and also through Facebook was the start of a coordinated effort to try to express the frustrations and reservations about these changes to the environmental process. And when you saw the Idle No More hashtag then emerge was at the beginning of December, when these women connecting with other people concerned about these groups and connecting with Indigenous groups started raising the alarm and tried to organize some protests. The first National Day of Protest was on December the 10th. And this was the first time that you had large-scale protests across different cities in this National Day of Action. This is from a demonstration in Edmonton. And this was the first time that suddenly there was national attention to this movement called Idle No More. And when you look at the discussion on Twitter, you see a spike at the time of these protests. A journalist asked Jessica Gordon, one of those four women, what the protest was about. Journalists want to know, what are you protesting about? What are your objectives? And her answer was, we're asserting our sovereignty against the colonial legislation being pushed through by the government. So much like in Occupy, it wasn't so much a we want this, it was we don't want this. It was a no. It was a stop doing what you're doing. This is wrong. What then happened over the month of December and January is that this grew into a large movement involving various Indigenous communities, but also bringing together people, activists, trade unionists, people who basically wanted to say no to the Conservative government of Stephen Harper, which has progressively tried to take take Canada to the right, much like you might see Tony Abbott trying to do with Australia. Again, so it sort of became this unified voice of saying, no, we don't like the way Canada is going, triggered by the environmental process and triggered by Indigenous concerns. What we then saw is that the Idle No More hashtag became this rallying call for the movement. And the reason we wanted to look at this is because it really gained a life of its own through Twitter. It was used, mobilized and organized, but also to publicize and put together a counter-narrative to what was being reported in the media. a different story was being told through this hashtag by the people taking part and the committed individuals connected to these issues. For the study, we looked at the 2 key months that this happened, which is from December till the end of January. When you look at the peaks, they tend to coincide with national days of action or days when there was movement on the political front. And this is a very sort of complicated, multi-leveled issue. There was environmental concerns, there were concerns with a particular band and issues where the chief then went on a hunger strike because of saying they weren't getting enough funds from federal government. All these issues were combined together and got this expression through the Idle No More hashtag. What we wanted to see is, well, given that this movement expressed itself through this hashtag, who were they listening to? Who were the prominent voices here? What kind of information was being circulated? And what does that tell us about what this group of committed individuals were listening to, were turning to, and what narrative is being co-constructed through the interactions on the network? So we had 741,164 tweets altogether, broken down by tweets, retweets, and mentions. So for this initial pass, we just looked at everything. Every single message that flowed on the network through these 2 months. And you see from the graphic, this is kind of how the movement portrayed itself as well, through the graphics that it put up on its Facebook pages and other pages like that. You know, blog, tweet, post, defend the rights. Again, make your voice heard. One sort of little interesting side note here is we looked at the breakdown by where those tweets came from. Did they come on a mobile phone or did they come from a non-mobile device? And you see here a significant number coming from mobile. Now, what that suggests to us is essentially this is people out on the streets taking part in these protests, essentially using the devices and the means that they had available to them at the time. In other words, their phone. And I think it might also explain why there's such a significant number of retweets, because it's easy to do a retweet on your mobile phone. It's hard to write tweets, especially if you're in a protest and it's ongoing and the situation is developing. So we're still working through this data. This is very much a preliminary introduction to it. Some of it is more developed than others, but I wanted to share some of the things that we're finding in the data and some of what we think this means. So as I said, we wanted to identify at this stage 2 things. One, who were the key voices that were being heard? Who were the actor types? And this comes from the study that I did with Seth Lewis and Rodriguez Amit from the University of Minnesota, where we looked at Andy Carbin and who he turned to as his sources during the Arab Spring, and using that model of the actor types. And in that study, what we found was that a quarter of his sources were activists, but they made up for 50% of his retweets. So very much activists influenced the narrative that Andy Carbin was telling, which of course, and what was interesting there is journalists were following Andy Carbin because he was essentially filtering and sorting the messages from the Middle East and made the life of the journalists easier. So essentially you have this narrative of English-speaking, largely Western-educated liberals creating a certain narrative through Twitter filtered by Andy Carbin, and then of course come the elections, the Islamists win something like 70% of the vote, and the West is surprised. What happened to the people like us who were tweeting about their wishes for democracy? So we wanted to look at the actor types to say, who are the prominent voices here? And secondly, we wanted to look at what the links that are being shared. Essentially, what do these groups of committed individuals value? What are they sharing in terms of the information from mainstream media or other sources? And what does that tell us about information flows? Another part of the study that I'm not going to talk today because we haven't finished the data is we've also looked at the sources used by mainstream media over this period. So much like we've looked at the actor types here, we want to say who are the actor types that mainstream media turn to as their sources for reporting on this movement. Our hypothesis is that they will be experts, officials, the usual types that journalists turn to, and will be rather at odds with what we find here. But we haven't finished that data, so I can't tell you about it, but that's our hypothesis based on journalism studies and where studies into journalism sourcing. So, first, look at the influences. And again, these are preliminary results. We're still finessing the data, but I wanted to give you an idea of what we found. So with this, we used a service called Topsy Pro to gather the data. And we're using their algorithms to determine influence. Now, as a limitation is we don't know how their algorithms work. What we do know is they're trying to measure attention. So it's not just about number of followers, it's not just about number of tweets, but it's also about who those people are connected to, who then are those people connected to try to get a degree of who are the people when they send a message, it grabs the attention of not just the greatest number of people, but other people who are then going to share that message and have influence. So we're using their algorithm because it makes it very simple for us to get this data and then start analyzing it. So when we break it down by actor type, this is what we get. And we use the same actor types that we used for the Carvin study to see who are the voices being heard here. So mainstream media is both publications and journalists. Alternative media institutions, and also alternative media journalists. Institutional elites includes NGOs, political actors, researchers, celebrities. And then alternative voices are activist organizations that are not media organizations, activists, and what we also call non-affiliated activists. So people who belong to an organization, but also people who say they're activists but don't belong to a particular organization. And we also have in that category bloggers, people constructing a counter-narrative. For this, in terms of categorizing the actor types, we use the same methodology we did with Carvin, which is how do people self-represent on Twitter? That was our starting point. So if their Twitter bio says activist at the beginning, they self-identify primarily as an activist. One of the things we found is, of course, we don't all just wear one hat. We wear several hats. I'm a researcher, I was a journalist, I like music, and I post pictures of my cat. So we all wear all these different hats on social media. But we're trying to, as much as possible, say, how were these people self-representing in terms of their identity? And then members of the public. People who didn't fall into an organization, didn't blog, didn't say, I'm an activist, weren't a member of a particular grouping, but actually took part in this. We think this is quite interesting, that essentially a lot of, what this suggests to us is there's a lot of people tweeting about Idle No More who might not be traditionally active, rather active in the traditional political sense, politics with a capital P, but still interested in what is happening in Canada and what is happening with the politics in Canada, but not necessarily involved through formal channels of political action. We also broke it down, I'll give you an idea, by share of tweets. And what I found interesting here is that when we think about the alternative media and alternative voices, it's really quite small in terms of the overall share of tweets. That the publics, the members of the public, were the ones behind a lot of those tweets. One of the things we want to do is break this down into tweets and retweets to see if there's some difference in terms of other publics, these publics, are they retweeting the messages from other people, or are they doing their own? We haven't got to that stage yet, so this is looking at everybody.
Excuse me, Alfred, I'm sorry to interrupt.
No, it's
Can you
fine.
go back one slide as well as that slide, and can you just clarify what influences mean? Because I'm reading your very large percentages of publics there at 47 and 60%. I mean, prima facie, these are, how can they be influences? when they don't have, they're not acting presumably strategically in this. I would imagine a lot of their activity will be retweeting rather than tweeting.
So the way Topsy Pro looks at this is saying that they're trying to evaluate who is paying, when somebody speaks, are they being paid attention to? So in this context, what you have is this phenomenon of crowdsourced elites, that those members of the public might not, in their everyday life, have any kind of particular influence. But in the information flows around this, other people said, this is an important message, I will retweet it or I will share it. So essentially we're trying to measure who is listening to who. And we've seen this through studies about the Arab Spring and also in Occupy, that essentially through the mechanisms of Twitter, through the retweets mechanisms, you get these crowdsourced elites. You know, some voices gain greater prominence than others. So we were trying to identify, out of everybody who sent a message, who were people listening to? And that's why, in this case, sort of the institutional power you have outside of the network is less significant than the power you develop in the network through the information you're sharing, or the links you're sharing, or your involvement in the network. Other people are valuing what you say. Which is why then you have this sort of breakdown, which is not what we might expect. But there's a caveat to this, and I'll get to it right now. First, we also coded whether these were indigenous voices or non-indigenous. And what's really interesting here is actually only a small, a quarter of them were indigenous voices. So even though this started very much as an indigenous movement, it became much more than just an indigenous movement. And it seems to us that a lot of the people here who were tweeting and retweeting were not from where the roots of this movement came, pointing to this sort of broad, disorganized coalition of people who wanted to say no to the Harper government, rather than yes to a particular issue. Now, so you saw that a large percentage of members of the public were in that top 500 of influential people. But when you look at who are the top influencers, you get a very different picture. So overall, out of the 500, a large section are members of the public. But when you look at, okay, out of that 500, and you look at, say here, the top 12, you actually see that institutional authority transfers to the network. So the existing information orders and power structures are reflected in the network on Twitter. So we have things like the Globe and Mail. The Globe and Mail is built itself as Canada's newspaper of record. So it has influence because it is Canada's newspaper of record. You have Andy Carvin, who will be influential because of his network, and that when Andy Carvin tweets something, people pay attention to it. You have Al Jazeera, which we classed as alternative media. And again, why is Al Jazeera the most influential here? Because it's Al Jazeera. Al Jazeera exists, again, in existing media. There's alternative voices such as Mona Tahawi, who became prominent during the Arab Spring. Again, she had authority before coming to the network and gained more there. PZ Myers is a biology prof, but really a very active science blogger with an activist agenda. So again, they have already pre-existing influence that they're transferring to the network. Laurie Penny down the end on the right-hand side writes for The Guardian, but essentially she writes columns on issues of social justice, gender, and digital politics. So again, as a journalist and author, she has authority outside of the network that translates into here. We have celebrities. So top right-hand side, Darren Jones. He's a Canadian comic and TV personality. So because they're on television and well-known, they're well-known here. Nelly Furtado, Canadian singer, pop star, a celebrity. They're well-known, transfers to the network. George Stroumboulopoulos, who, if you Google Canada's boyfriend, you'll get George Stroumboulopoulos. But So he's influential because he's Canada's boyfriend. But he's a CBC TV personality. He has a chat show. He's on at 7 every evening, and then again at I think 11:30. So again, he already has influence. Canada's boyfriend is rivaled by Jean Ghomeshi, who is another CBC personality. He has one of the main cultural radio shows on every day. So again, very influential type of person. And then Mickey James, and I had to look up because I didn't know who Mickey James is. And they're an American pro wrestler turned country singer. So when you break it down in terms of, yes, we have 50% members of the public that are part of that top 500, but they're basically part of that long tail of the top 500, where their influence on a scale of 1 to 10 is quite low. And you still see some of what we might call these elites from through media, through structures like celebrity, still dominated there. So we contrast this with who was most active, who sent out the most tweets. And you see that essentially people might be sending thousands of tweets, but was anybody listening? Was anybody paying attention? No, they were paying attention to these people. They were paying attention to Nelly Furtado. They were paying attention to George Stropolopoulos. They weren't paying attention to these people here. So again, it's not just volume of tweets. It's a likelihood that every time you say something, people will pay attention to it. So the other side of this is looking at the messaging. Essentially, what links were being shared and selected by the network is the most important. And again, we've done the same thing, the most influential links here. Now we're still working through the data. I just wanted to have something to share with you. These are by no way final figures because it really was a back of an envelope calculation. So I'd have something to say here. So this might change, but our initial analysis suggested about a third of links that were being shared came from traditional media. So mostly they tended to come from CBC, the national broadcaster. They came from the Toronto Star, which is the best-selling newspaper in the country. They came from the Globe and Mail, that portrays itself as the newspaper of record, and the National Post, which is kind of like our Australian newspaper. Alternative media made up something between 15 and 20%. So we have about a third mainstream media, 15 to 20 alternative media. And some of this was the Aboriginal People's Television Network, which is a network, Indigenous television network, Democracy Now!, and then a site called Rabble.ca, a recently online only that is very much sort of activist, sort of alternative media. And Rabble.ca had more links than any of the other mainstream media apart from CBC. So what I find interesting with this is that if we have a third that came from mainstream media, well, it coincides with a study that was done a couple of years ago that I was peripherally involved with. This was done by a group called Samara, that's a non-profit group trying to promote better democratic life in Canada. And they looked in 2011 at the links being shared around a couple of hashtags in Canada. First, CDN Poly, which is the Canadian political hashtag, the main one, and then Occupy. And what they found was that when it came to Occupy, about a third of the links were from traditional media, which is kind of interesting that our stats seem to suggest that, again, with Idle No More, a third were to traditional media. Not quite sure what it means, but it's just kind of interesting that we have very, very similar figures. So much like when we think about influence, there's, out of that 500, there's a sort of top 20, 25. Similarly, when it came to the links. So here are the 5 most influential news stories shared on the network. And essentially, they're all from Al Jazeera. So we might have 15, 20% from alternative media. That's because a lot of it is Al Jazeera counting there. So Al Jazeera having a really predominant effect in terms of the information being shared here. And what's interesting is when looking at what type of material were they sharing, there's a certain narrative that comes from these stories from Al Jazeera. So they talk about the movement gaining momentum. So the narrative is, look, somebody like Al Jazeera, an international broadcaster, is paying attention to our movement in Canada, and they're being positive about it. They're saying we're gaining ground. What else are they talking about? They're saying we're marching on. Again, progressive, positive enforcement of the movement. They're talking about what's happening in Canada as a native winter. So you have the echoes of the Arab Spring. Again, messages that kind of affirm the legitimacy of the movement. You have things from The Guardian like this, a comment piece that talks very positively about what this movement might mean. So again, a Canadian movement is getting international recognition and getting positive press. This piece concludes by saying, the importance of #IdleNoMore cannot be overstated. Grassroots movements are what have ensured the survival of Aboriginal culture and what remains of an Aboriginal land base. If it grows in energy and coordinates in a network of activism, like defenders of the land, it could be a powerful force to reset Aboriginal-state relations. So again, a very positive interpretation of what is happening in Canada, gaining international recognition. At the same time, the other set of links that were being shared were things that were critical of the movement. Essentially, mainstream media things like here is the Sun News Network is Canada's Fox News, except they have no audience, literally no audience. And this is Ezra Levant, the most provocative commentator, very right-wing. And here he's talking about a band in Atawapiskat, who was complaining that they weren't getting enough federal funding. And the point of this piece is he's saying, no, they're getting lots of money, they're wasting it because they're corrupt and spending it all sorts of useless projects. But what we then see is this being shared by people contesting it, taking it on, saying, look, this is what the Sun is saying about us. What's interesting with this, the Atawapiskat angle, is that when this came out, as people were saying, Atawapiskat, they're being irresponsible with their money, i.e. the natives can't look after money. What then happened on Twitter is you had a counter hashtag emerging, Ottawapiskat, Ottawa-skat. And that was essentially saying, so you're complaining that Ottawapiskat can't look after its money? Okay, let's look for examples of the federal government misspending money. So for this day, you had this sort of counter-narrative around Ottawapiskat with people sharing examples of federal waste. And it was a hashtag that bubbled up in a day and then disappeared. Since I was coming to Australia, I thought I'd pick this one out from the Australia. And it's talking about an Aboriginal boy that was found guilty of stealing a pack of hamburger buns and then sentenced to 12 months in jail. That was one of the most shared links. And it basically came in a tweet from a yoga teacher in Sydney. And what I found interesting here is how the hashtag is also used to frame the story. So they're trying to say, well, yeah, it's shameful, it's racism, but also within the context of Occupy Sydney, but then within the context of Idle No More. Almost saying, yes, you know, this is how Indigenous groups are treated in Canada, this is how Indigenous groups are treated here. Making those connections through the hashtag and telling a certain story. When you look at the hashtags that surrounded Idle No More, you get a similar kind of story. We have Canadian politics hashtag, the Canada hashtag, then we have Indigenous, asserting and affirming the Indigenous roots of this movement. But then things like no KXL, so no to the Keystone XL pipeline. So this is a controversial proposal to take tar sands oil from Alberta to the States. So you have, again, trying to frame the Idle No More no movement, also in the context of no to Keystone. Native winter, again, framing it like Canada's Arab Spring except it's native winter, and attaching it to Occupy, sort of legitimizing that movement by saying we're like Occupy, expressing a certain narrative through that. So these are preliminary conclusions, but what we think this means is how this group of committed individuals were using the I Don't Know More hashtag as a device for particle political framing, for trying to assert a kind of narrative to infect the network with certain ideas, both in terms of who they regarded as influential voices and what kind of materials were being shared. And really, this is within the context of a mainstream media in Canada that has a terrible record in terms of its reporting on Indigenous affairs. And even during this time, very much the mainstream media was either ignored the movement or tended to dismiss it. And I'll give you an example from a column penned by a guy called Rex Murphy. He's one of Canada's most well-known journalists. He's on the CBC, but he also writes columns for newspapers. And he wrote one for the National Post, which is our most right-leaning newspaper, much like the Australian. So the headline on this piece was, "Natives need to tone down the anger." And then the subhead was, "There's not a serious citizen of this country who does not ardently wish for a better life for all natives." So you see Jessica Gordon talking about we're basically against the colonial mindset. And what do you have this journalist writing? A colonial mindset. Natives, calm down. Just let us get on with things. We know what's best for you. And Rex Murphy in this piece spends most of it chastising the I Don't Know More for its angry tone and for its angry words. Essentially, very much that colonial mindset being expressed in the mainstream media. So one of the things we think comes through the I Don't Know More hashtag, both in the people identified as influencers and the links, is this idea of contesting the mainstream media, contesting the narratives and the stories being told about them. Essentially trying to say, no, that's not who we are. That is inaccurate. So something like the Sun News Network gets shared because people want to contest it. The reports on Atawapiskat and misspending get contested through the offshoot Atawapiskat hashtag attached to the I Don't Know More hashtag. So you have that saying, no, that's not our story. But I think the other side of this is affirmation. And partly through highlighting people who are tweeting about the movement. It's like saying, look, Nelly Furtado has tweeted about I Don't Know More. We're being recognized by one of Canada's premier pop stars. Look, John Gomeshi and George Stroumboulopoulos are tweeting about us, generally in a positive light. Again, we're being recognized by CBC personalities. This kind of, our movement is valid because we've been legitimized by people in power, either through celebrity status or through media status. We see that through some of the links being shared in Al Jazeera and The Guardian, this kind of international recognition of the movement. And this is also significant in a Canadian context because much like in Australia, Canada sometimes feels rather neglected on the world stage, and it does tend to have a very big neighbor next door. So when suddenly Canada makes international news, that's news in Canada. Because it's like, look, we are important. People are paying attention to what we do. So here we're seeing the same sort of thing with the I Don't Know More protesters saying, look, we are important. Al Jazeera, The Guardian. People are paying attention to us outside of Canada. So my colleague, Candice Callison, came up with a way of thinking about this, suggesting that we think of social media as the middle ground. And for this, she's building on an idea suggested by an American historian, Richard White, who wrote a book about when Europeans encountered Indians in North America. And his book is called The Middle Ground. And he suggests that we should go beyond stories of either conquest and assimilation on one side, and then stories of resistance and persistence on the other. And then instead think of that there's a search for accommodation, common meaning taking place here. And that in this middle ground terrain, it exists because neither side has the absolute upper hand. They both have strengths and weaknesses, but they offset each other. And in some ways, when we looking at the data we have and looking at what was happening here, thinking in terms of in this case, Twitter, as that middle ground, where yes, elites such as mainstream media, celebrities, TV personalities have strength that transfers to this middle ground. But at the same time, crowdsourced elites chosen by members within that group have some power to counter those messages. This idea of a contested space where they don't, a contested space where neither side has naturally the upper hand, but they're still trying to work out the dynamics of interaction. What was interesting here, particularly with Idle No More in terms of the indigenous movement, was that yes, it was used to mobilize, to amplify, but it also became a way of re-articulating identity, and re-articulating in some ways a national indigenous identity, rather than one related to regional bands or local bands. And re-articulating a message of anti-colonialism and sort of white imperialism. So narratives that just never get heard in the mainstream media because journalists don't talk about colonialism and imperialism. And again, my colleague Candice Callison talks about this in terms of people reasserting their heritage and re-articulating their narratives, recovering their historical narratives through these interactions. But also, this was more than just an indigenous movement. As you saw when we broke down the number of the influencers, only a quarter were indigenous. So it also points to people concerned about the environment, human rights, labor groups, people interested in politics with a small p, Canadians who are not happy with the right-leaning direction of the government and the way that government is trying to push Canada towards the right. But I think it also suggests to me this idea of Twitter as a hybrid space for the cultural production of journalism. This kind of ambient news, that this news, opinion, experience, emotion is all being circulated here and being co-constructed as people use these mechanisms to interact with each other, and certain narratives emerge from it. Essentially, how citizens are involved in the framing, the flow, the reinterpreting of certain messages through both who they decide we should pay attention to and what information they decide we should pay attention to. This kind of idea of this middle ground, this media space, where you have media spheres that are operating in parallel in a symbiotic relationship, sometimes not necessarily beneficial to each other, but trying to figure out who has the power here, what stories are being told, and how can we counter it. So that's all. Thank you.
Thank you very much.